There was an irregular note, written in ink darker than the rest of the document, filed in the records of Blue Ridge County, year 1901. The line clashed with the official standard, as if it had been added by someone who did not wish to disappear into the bureaucracy. It read, 44 men entered the forest that week, 2 returned. None of them spoke of the shed. And it is from this sentence, and from the gaps it left behind, that this account begins. Before going on, the chronicler who reconstructs this story usually asks listeners to discreetly leave, in the comments, which city they are watching from and what time it is now, as if that simple gesture brought them closer to the past that is about to be revisited. The case of the Crowford twins and the 44 missing loggers does not belong to the realm of exaggerated legends, nor to folk narratives inflated by imagination. It is recorded with rigidity and sobriety, in minutes, search reports, military correspondence and fragmented testimonies. And although more than a century has passed since the last time their names were officially spoken, there are details that remain unreachable, as if the forest had absorbed not only bodies, but also voices, intentions, and fears. The brothers Elias and Nathaniel Crowford were born in 1879, sons of a sawmill worker and a reading teacher who lived on the southern edge of the mountainous territory of Blue Ridge, a region marked by dense hills, trees that creaked in winter, and trails that opened and vanished with the seasons. They were identical twins, but those who lived with them reported deep differences. While Elias possessed a sense of discipline, almost embarrassing for someone his age, always attentive to work, tools, accounts, promises, Nathaniel seemed to live on a nebulous border between responsibility and restlessness. The community of Blue Ridge, still expanding at the beginning of the 20th century, was made up of families who lived from cutting wood, extracting resin and transporting logs along muddy roads. The sound of saws, the steam of trains and the sharp smell of sap soaked into the wagons were part of the everyday landscape. Many inhabitants recorded their days in simple notebooks where they wrote down the amount of wood extracted, debts, fevers that appeared in autumn, losses, and even small conflicts between neighbors. These records, when analyzed together, show that the Crowford family was not necessarily influential, but was respected for its uprightness and constant work. In 1901, the loggers of the region were facing a period of expansion. Outside companies had begun hiring entire crews to open larger clearings and transport wood out of Blue Ridge. 44 of these men, some well-known and others newly arrived, formed a team that would work for 2 weeks deep inside the Montgrave Forest, an area considered difficult because of the density of the trees, occasional landslides, and lack of safe routes. Elias Crowford was assigned as the group's logistics assistant, in charge of checking supplies, recording schedules, and supervising small movements. Nathaniel, in turn, asked to accompany them as an occasional helper, although he was not officially registered. According to later testimonies, the two brothers planned to save enough to buy a small sawmill of their own. The group's departure was described by residents as quiet, practical, and without ceremony. The horses carried food, lanterns, tools, ropes, and tarps. The men walked in disciplined fashion, used to the weight and risk of their trade. The weather was relatively stable for the time of year, with a light mist that, according to some diaries, came and went as if it were breathing. However, among the documents from 1901, one seemingly insignificant detail has always caught the attention of researchers who revisited the case almost 100 years later. In the inventory written by Elias Crowford, the last document signed by him before entering the forest, there is a mention of a support shed on the old Montgrave Trail. No other official record mentions this shed. No map from the time indicates its existence. Neither of the two men who returned from the expedition spoke of it directly. The story, therefore, begins where the records start to fail. And it is at this point, where words become hesitant, where the ink trembles and where silences weigh more than the notes themselves, that the mystery takes shape. In the months leading up to the disappearance, daily life in Blue Ridge followed the predictable rhythm of a community accustomed to surviving among mountains, timber, and silence. Life there was modest in comfort, but extraordinarily rich in effort. Each family carried in its own hands the daily proof of its survival. It was like that for the Crowfords. The twins' house stood a little more than a half-hour walk from the town's commercial center, a cluster of simple buildings, a general store, a blacksmith shop, a sawdust depot, a post office, that served as a meeting point for residents. The father, Horace Crowford, worked long hours at the local sawmill. The mother, Lydia, taught children in a small wooden annex behind the church and was known for her almost unfailing patience. Elias had inherited from her the attachment to details and discipline. Nathaniel, on the other hand, seemed to have absorbed only the taste for language, for improvisation, and for the tendency to lose himself in his own thoughts. The twins' daily routine, to a certain extent, was complementary. While Elias woke before sunrise to organize tools and review supply lists, Nathaniel took a few more minutes to truly wake up, always observing the landscape from the window as if trying to understand something that still had no name. Despite these differences, the brothers shared a deep bond and were rarely seen arguing. Residents recall that Elias was the one who made practical decisions. Nathaniel was the one who calmed tensions. One balanced the other. In that early 1901, the hiring of the 44 loggers brought unusual activity to the region. The increased demand for wood meant more work, but also more risks, since the expeditions extended into poorly mapped areas. Between January and March, Blue Ridge recorded at least 4 incidents involving falling timber, animal attacks, and trails blocked by sudden landslides. Nothing that had not happened before, but enough to reinforce the mountain's reputation as unpredictable territory. Accounts from the time, preserved in personal notebooks and letters sent to neighboring counties, indicate that the team selected for the Mongrave expedition was made up of experienced men. There were veterans with more than 10 years in the trade, young beginners seeking a living, immigrants trying to start over, and seasonal workers. However, among them all, the Crowfords stood out not only for being twins, but for representing a kind of bridge between the company's organization and local experience. Elias knew every curve of the Blue Ridge trails. Nathaniel, though less disciplined, understood like few others the dynamics of the workers. In the days before departure, testimonies suggest that something seemed off in Nathaniel's behavior. A close colleague, Thomas Greeley, stated in an interview given in 1924 that the young man spent too much time watching the valley, as if waiting for someone or something. Others reported that he had commented almost casually that he heard metallic sounds coming from the forest during the night, something like tools striking or crates being dragged. These accounts, however, have always been treated cautiously by historians, since the region produced many nighttime sounds caused by wind, animals, or trees giving way. Elias, in turn, seemed even more focused than usual. According to the store's records, he revisited the supply list 3 times in the same week, making small changes in the inventory. One of those changes included a vague mention of an additional stopping point that did not appear on official maps. This detail, when compared to the enigmatic support shed mentioned in the final document, raised questions that would only emerge decades later. The twins' mother, Lydia, also left an indirect record. In a letter sent to her sister dated April 3, 1901, she wrote, "Elias has been sleeping little, Nathaniel even less, but neither of them speaks clearly about why. They leave tomorrow. I hope the work does them good." This letter, preserved by chance inside a box of photographs, became one of the most commented pieces by contemporary researchers, for it suggests that there was tension between the brothers, even if silent, even if inexplicable. On the day before the expedition, some residents reported seeing the twins talking in low voices near the old town well. A witness, who at the time was only 11 years old, said decades later that the two seemed to disagree but did not raise their voices. The memory was blurry, like all memories recovered too late, but the testimony fit with other narratives that suggested something unresolved between them. Even so, nothing, absolutely nothing, in those days indicated that the Mongrave expedition would become one of the greatest human losses ever recorded in the county's forestry history. The men left at dawn, and much was recorded about that moment. The mist rising from the valley, the muffled sound of footsteps on the damp earth, the tools knocking lightly against the horses' saddles, the lanterns tied to backpacks, the smell of coffee hastily handed around. Some residents remember that Nathaniel cast one last look back, as if he wanted to mentally record the outline of the houses. Elias, in contrast, walked on without hesitation. What no one knew, neither those who stayed nor those who left, was that on the fringes of the records of the time, small signs were already settling like loose pieces of a puzzle. An incomplete note at the post office, a map with a trail crossed out and redrawn, a comment about sounds heard too far away to be normal, and at the center of all this, a shed that officially never existed. The last confirmed records of the Montgrave expedition allow us to reconstruct, with reasonable accuracy, what happened up to the 8th day. After that, everything fragments into gaps and echoes, as if the forest had devoured not only the men, but also their trails and accounts. On the first day, the team advanced along known routes. The weather was stable, with a thin mist hanging among the trees, enough to moisten clothes but not to impair visibility. Elias recorded the distance covered, the number of tools and the break times, notes that survived in his notebook, found years later in surprisingly well-preserved condition. Nathaniel, according to the loggers' own testimonies, was less focused on the work and more attentive to the sounds around them, turning his head from time to time as if expecting something to emerge from between the trunks. As they advanced, the terrain became more uneven. On the third day, light showers hardened the soil and left deep marks from the horses' hooves, tracks that would disappear entirely after the fourth day. Montgrave Forest was known for this. It absorbed traces as quickly as it created them. The men set up camp on a small slope surrounded by tall pines that creaked when the wind passed through. From the 5th day on, reports of strange behavior began to accumulate, not as official records, but as reconstructions made years later by indirect survivors, relatives and residents who heard muffled accounts from someone who almost told, but gave up at the last moment. According to these accounts, Nathaniel claimed more than once to have seen a wooden structure among the trees, always at a distance, something low, square, a shack, or perhaps an old storage building. When he mentioned it to Elias, the brother supposedly answered in a dry, almost irritated tone, saying that it didn't matter. This detail, the tone of the response, appears in more than one testimony, which suggests that Elias, a methodical and calm man, might have been carrying a concern he did not record in his notebooks. The last day with confirmed records began at dawn, on the 8th day of the expedition. The weather remained stable, but the silence of the forest was described in later accounts as too heavy for that time of year. The birdsong seemed more spaced out, and the cracking of trees came from confusing directions. The group advanced to a narrow clearing where they intended to begin cutting wood. But before they could set up camp, Elias is said to have asked everyone to wait while he checked the side trail. This moment marks the last time the twins were seen together. A logger named Harlan Dufour stated in 1919 that he saw the two quietly arguing near a slope. He did not hear the words but noticed tense gestures. Nathaniel pointed toward some place in the forest. Elias shook his head, his face rigid. Minutes later, both disappeared among the trees. The men carried on working for a while, but were puzzled by the brothers' delay. When two of them went to look for the twins, they found only footprints crossing a muddy patch, and just beyond, nothing. The dry, uneven ground erased tracks easily. Some members of the group began to worry. Others believed the brothers were simply exploring the area, as so many loggers did. But two things drew attention. Elias had left his notebook at the camp, something he never did. Nathaniel's compass was found lying a few meters from the trail, as if it had slipped from his pocket in a sudden movement. Night fell before the rest of the group reached any conclusion, and it is here that all the accounts converge with disturbing precision. The men said that the silence of that night was the most absolute they had ever experienced. There was no wind, There were no animals, not even the rustling of leaves. The lanterns lit only a few meters ahead, revealing dark trunks and patches of mist. It was in that silence that the first disappearance in the group occurred. According to indirect testimonies, since neither of the two survivors ever spoke of it in life, 3 men on watch heard light footsteps, like someone walking barefoot on the damp earth. They pointed their lanterns, but saw nothing. Then they heard it again. This time, closer. One of them, impulsive, took 2 steps outside the circle of light, and did not return. The other 2 shouted, called their colleague by name, but got no answer. The forest remained mute, motionless, as if it were part of an old photograph. Shortly afterwards, 2 more men vanished, not simultaneously, but in short intervals, always after stepping away from the camp to investigate sounds. By that point, panic had taken over the group. 8 men gathered around the main fire, trying to decide whether they should stay there until dawn or attempt to return along the trail at night. Some wept, others prayed, others swore they had seen silhouettes among the trees. Diverging accounts suggest that, at some point in the early morning, someone mentioned an abandoned shed nearby, a support structure used by early explorers. That comment, however, was never officially attached to the expedition. It appears only in interviews conducted decades later. The final chaos began around 3 in the morning, according to investigators' estimates. A tree fell, not due to wind, but apparently from age and wear. And in the crash that followed, some men ran away from the light. It was the last collective mistake. The indirect survivors, relatives who heard deathbed confessions, men who listened to drunken accounts, describe that moment as a total breakdown of discipline. Each of the loggers ran in a different direction. When the sun rose, only 2 men were alive. They were found wandering the trails days later, exhausted, dehydrated, unable to explain what had happened. One died a few weeks later of pneumonia. The other, the only possible direct witness, never gave a formal statement. Not out of refusal, but incapacity. He would panic at any question that mentioned the expedition. The only document that remained from the crew was Elias's notebook, recovered from the abandoned camp. In it, the last note read, "Old trail. Structure ahead. Assess tomorrow." No arrow, no name, no detail. But there was still something else. A detail investigators ignored for almost 30 years. Between the final pages, used as an improvised bookmark, there was a sliver of wood, not belonging to any of the trees in the region. And on the side of the sliver, someone had carved, with the tip of a knife, 2 letters, S.H. This loose fragment, an initial, a piece of unknown wood, and a shed never recorded, would make the Crowford case not just a mass disappearance, but one of the most persistent enigmas in the Blue Ridge archives. The days that followed the disappearance of the 44 men plunged Blue Ridge into a restlessness that was recorded not only in official documents, but in the community's very habits. Families began keeping lamps lit for longer. Tools were put away before sunset. Children stopped playing near the trails. It was as if the entire region had entered a state of listening. A hard, silent vigilance turned toward the edges of Montgrave Forest. News of the tragedy reached the county through a small group of scouts sent by the logging company. They reported finding signs of an abandoned camp, tools dropped in haste, and confusing traces of footprints scattering in all directions. The weather, previously stable, had turned humid and erratic, obscuring any remaining tracks. A preliminary report classified the event as an operational disaster, but no one truly believed that explanation. Search parties were sent out immediately, made up of residents, local authorities, and volunteers from neighboring counties. For almost 2 weeks, Montgrave Forest became the center of an operation that combined despair and discipline. The scouts walked in lines, called out for the missing men, marked trees with machetes and lit torches during the night. But the forest answered only with the same deep silence recorded by the survivors on the 8th day of the expedition. The first significant discovery came on the 4th day of searches. They found Elias Crowford's backpack, caught among roots, probably dragged there by the rain. Inside it were clothes, An empty canteen, some crumpled papers, and, curiously, a set of small keys tied with a simple cord. The keys did not match anything the family recognized. They opened no safes, no known chests, no local doors. That detail fed, from the beginning, the suspicion that some kind of built structure was involved, even though the official records insisted on denying the existence of any building in that part of the forest. On the 6th day of searching, the men found something even more disturbing: the remains of an isolated, very recent campfire in an area where the official team had never passed. The fire contained wood splinters identical to those found inside Elias's notebook. This reignited rumors about the mysterious shed, rumors the authorities tried unsuccessfully to control. Meanwhile, in town, the Crowford families lived in suspended mourning. Horace, the father, remained firm during the day, but was seen walking alone at night, following the contour of the hill as if he expected to see his sons appear at any moment. Lydia, the mother, received neighbors with serenity, but wrote long letters she never sent, recording fears and hypotheses she did not have the courage to voice. The logging company pressed for an official conclusion. It cited costs, risks, and the need to resume activity, but the county refused to close the case. Something in that story seemed far too incomplete to be reduced to a mere tragedy. It was in this tense atmosphere that ambiguous testimonies emerged. Fragmented, always spoken in low tones, as if they might compromise those who uttered them. A man named Arthur Leving, a resident of a distant village, claimed to have seen 2 figures carrying crates on the night the expedition disappeared. He said they were on the old trail, heading toward an area where, supposedly, there had once been a shed at the start of the century. Arthur was known for exaggeration, but his statement coincided with the point where the fire and the wood splinters were found. Another testimony came from a woman named Ruth Stanning, who reported having heard, on the night of the disappearance, a kind of distant hammering, like tools striking planks, even though she lived miles from the forest. She had no reason to lie, and her recollection matched earlier comments made by Nathaniel about metallic sounds coming from improbable places. Even with these accounts, the official investigation avoided linking any unknown structure to the disappearance. The county chose to record the case as a fatal dispersion in hostile terrain, but the residents never accepted that version. Years later, in 1924, a special commission revisited the case. That was when the wood fragment marked with the letters SH became the center of attention. The initials did not match any public record of owners, companies, or builders from the time. Researchers put forward hypotheses. Could it be someone's name, the initials of a structure, the mark of an old supplier? Nothing was proven. During that review, an almost forgotten fact came to light. In a secondary report from the first search, a document that had remained for decades tucked away among administrative files, there was a casual mention of an old shed, possibly used by loggers at the end of the 19th century. The document did not specify location, size, or owner. It was just a marginal note, written without emphasis, almost like a personal reminder: shed near the old trail, abandoned, do not use. That line belatedly rekindled the connection with the support shed cited in Elias's inventory, but when the team tried to locate the exact spot described, they discovered that the maps had been altered over the years, trails closed, bridges modified, clearings erased by storms. Any attempt to find the shed turned into a maze. The most impactful revelation, however, did not come from maps or reports, but from a late testimony. The second survivor, the only one who remained alive, never spoke officially, but in 1931, during his stay in a sanatorium in Lexington, he mentioned a sentence repeated by Nathaniel shortly before everything collapsed. He knew about the shed. He had already been there. The sentence, written down by a nurse who knew nothing of the case, was rediscovered in 1956 by a researcher studying old hospital records. It suggested for the first time that Elias Crowford, the calm, logical, methodical brother, might have had prior knowledge of the structure lost in the forest, and with that possibility, the case gained another layer, a layer that did not accuse, but insinuated, a layer that did not resolve, but shifted the center of gravity of the tragedy. There were no clear villains. There were no certainties. Only a growing question. What was really inside that shed? And, perhaps more unsettling, why did Elias mention it but never speak about it? Decades after the disappearance of the Crowfords and the 44 loggers, the case remains like a grey stain in the Blue Ridge archives, a scar that time has tried to soften, but that still throbs quietly whenever some researcher decides to revisit yellowed papers, late testimonies, or wood fragments preserved by chance. The historian who reconstructed this account, and who breathed new life into Elias's final pages, the residents' scattered memories, and the marginal notes from the investigation, often says that no disappearance truly ends. Searches come to an end. Official investigations end. Even the most stubborn hopes eventually end. But the silence left by those who are gone remains active, reorganizing memories and reinterpreting gestures that once seemed insignificant. In revisiting this case more than a century later, it becomes inevitable to imagine how those days were lived by those who stayed behind. Lydia Crowford, for example, continued to write letters to her sons for months, even with nowhere to send them. In these letters preserved by the family, there was no accusation, no explicit despair, only a human attempt to keep alive a connection that time insisted on erasing. In her final records, she wrote that she always dreamed of the same scene, a narrow trail lit only by the pale glow of dawn, where two silhouettes walked side by side. She never knew whether they were memories or hopes. Horace, the father, died a few years later. In his estate, an improvised map of Montgrave Forest was found, as if he himself had tried in secret to reconstruct paths and guess erased points. The map, incomplete and scribbled over, seemed more an emotional attempt than a geographic one. The search of a man for a land where he had left everything he had. For the community of Blue Ridge, the case became a symbol of what the forest could do to those who entered its domain unwittingly. There was no talk of curses or hidden forces. That was never part of local culture nor of the official records. People spoke only of silence, the kind of silence that does not intimidate, but watches, the kind of silence that does not threaten, but absorbs. The truth is that no document found to this day has been able to explain why Elias mentioned the shed, nor why Nathaniel seemed so restless in the days leading up to the expedition. No one managed to locate the structure. No one identified the initials SH, and no one could say what happened in the hours between the brothers' argument and their disappearance. But of all the preserved fragments, one stands out to contemporary researchers. The sliver of wood marked with the initials and kept between the final pages of Elias's notebook. Why did he place it there? Was it a warning, a record, or just an object found by chance, turned into evidence by the lack of answers? When we hold that sliver today, we can feel the irregularity of its surface, the residual smell of time and a kind of wear that does not resemble the trees of Montgrave. It is as if it came from a different place, intimate and at the same time inaccessible, a fragment of something larger, lost among redrawn maps and trails, swallowed by the forest. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson left by the records. There are stories that are not resolved by reaching the end, but by understanding that the end, when it comes, is not an answer. It is only a boundary, the boundary between what is known and what will never be recovered. Today, researchers, the curious and descendants of those 44 men, visit the region from time to time. They walk along the remaining trails, watch the light filtered through the pines, listen to the wind that went for decades without witnesses, and try to imagine what the forest was like at the beginning of the 20th century. Some claim to feel the presence of the past in subtle changes in the landscape, fallen trunks, where once there were clearings, exposed roots, where once there were safe passages. Others prefer simply to observe, without looking for answers, as if, in doing so, they honored the men who disappeared there. The historian who tells this story often ends his classes with a phrase that, although simple, echoes with the weight of everything that was left behind. The forest does not owe us answers, only testimony. And so the case of the Crowford twins remains, suspended between yellowed pages, incomplete maps and rumors that time has not been able to erase. An enigma without villains, without heroes, without final explanations. Only human beings, lost trails and a shed whose existence could never be proven, but which for some reason continues to cast a shadow over every new reading of the documents. In the end, only silence remains, the same silence that took over the forest that dawn, the same silence that now envelops these last lines, and it is in that silence that this story takes its leave.